welcome to the first edition of POTUS 2016. We will be here each week calling the presidential horse race, and in our segment, Evidence-Based Politics, delving into a single issue with a scholar who can pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Today, Mexican immigration by the real numbers. By the way, if the acronym POTUS doesn't ring an old bell from TV's West Wing or from your years with the Secret Service, POTUS is the acronym for President of the United States. First up tonight, yes, the horse race. It was an eventful week in the campaign. Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker, who led in polls at the start of the year, had to drop out, short of followers, funds, and TV charisma. He framed his exit as a Republican Party favor to help bring down the more telegenic competition, Donald Trump.
I believe that I'm being called to lead by helping to clear the field in this race so that a positive, conservative message can rise to the top of the field. With this in mind, I will suspend my campaign immediately. I encourage other Republican presidential candidates to consider doing the same so that the voters can focus on a limited number of candidates who can offer a positive, conservative alternative to the current frontrunner.
Yes, Walker wants other candidates to follow him out the door. Looking at the CNN opinion research poll from Sunday, that was soon after GOP debate number 2, we see the top 5 candidates trending this way. Trump at about 24%. That's down from 32% a couple of weeks back. Ex-Hewlett-Packard CEO Fiorina soaring to 15% from a mere 3%. Dr. Ben Carson down to 14%. He had been near 20%. Senator Marco Rubio rising way up to 11% from 3%. Governor Jeb Bush is still treading water at 9%. And on the Democratic side, the polls have Hillary Clinton, surprise, surprise, way in front of Bernie Sanders nationally. CNN ORC showed her lead at 10 points 2 weeks back, up to 18 recently. Note, Vice President Joe Biden draws nearly as much support as Sanders, but other polls show Sanders higher. And of course, Biden's not running yet. Former Maryland Governor Martin O'Malley shows up a bit better in more recent polling, but still just above 1%. Former Senators Jim Webb and Lincoln Chafee are below 1%. So, what do we make of this week's campaign developments? Is the GOP establishment looking for a way to fire the Donald? Is Hillary getting past Servergate? Joining us, Oren Cass, Domestic Policy Director for the 2008 Mitt Romney campaign and Senior Fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the conservative think tank, and political scientist Christina Greer, author of Black Ethnics, Race, Immigration, and the Pursuit of the American Dream. Welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. An exciting week on the campaign trail. And I want to play another clip. First, here is Pope Francis praising President Obama at the White House on climate change. Hillary Clinton, by the way, within the 24 hours of the Pope's arrival, came out against the Keystone XL pipeline. Let's see what the Pope said at the White House.
Mr. President, I find it encouraging that you are proposing an initiative for reducing air pollution. Accepting the urgency, it seems clear to me also that climate change is a problem we can no longer be left to a future generation.
All right, Oren, I know one of your specialties is energy, and that you wrote a critique of the Pope's encyclical or the way people were reading it. Then there's Hillary Clinton coming out against the XL pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline, which she didn't take a position on as Secretary of State. Very interesting timing that it coincides with the Pope's arrival when everybody knew he was going to talk about climate change.
It could be that everyone knew he was going to talk about climate change. It could also be that she just knew they wouldn't talk about her. This, I think, to some degree looks like an attempt to bury what is a popular position with a small segment of the Democratic Party, but is not a popular position generally and also a position it's not clear how much she believes in. You know, it was very interesting to see her defense of the move, which talked very little about actually substantively what she thought it would mean one way or the other, and a lot about just complaining that it was a political distraction. So she almost acknowledged that this was a political rationale more than an actual policy decision. So
what about the politics of this? Because certainly it could be what Oren argues, which is that she buried this announcement in, you know, to the most blacked out campaign news 48 hours that you could possibly have, because everybody's going to be talking about the Pope, and she'll be on page 83.
Right, and I think that's some of the issues that Democrats have with her as a potential leader, where as Secretary of State, she should have and possibly could have taken a real leading role in saying, if she fundamentally believed in it, saying that she was against it. And so she is going to wait until no one's really paying attention to sort of say it when no one's really listening. So that small section of diehards that actually really do not want that to take place will have it on record that she doesn't want it. And then all the other people, especially the people in the economic sphere, may not be paying attention right now. We might be able to circle back to it, but there's so many other issues. She's probably hoping and counting on the fact that it'll get lost in a long line of other things.
All right. We played the clip of Scott Walker urging other Republicans to follow his lead and leave the race. What do you make of that?
Well, I think all politics is local, and I think that he possibly made some calculuses about what was going on in Wisconsin, and the longer he stayed, and really made no impact in the race in a substantive way, especially these deflated expectations that people had of him. Many people thought that he would be one of the shining stars, and if not a real nominee, at least a vice presidential contender.
That might be why he left. But
right.
Why did he urge others to leave?
Well, urging others to leave, I think, so it doesn't look as like he's quitting, right? I mean, and mind you, he didn't quit. He's suspending it, and that has some financial implications, I believe. But I really do think that there's this home state idea that he's really thinking about and sort of protecting his governorship, but also essentially saying, well, I mean, we're now down to 15 candidates. You know, many Democrats are joking. I mean, this did happen in 2012, but there is a time to get serious. And I think many Republican operatives, and you can agree or disagree, really do feel like Trump is sucking out a lot of energy. Many people know that it won't last too long, but it's lasted way too long as far as many people are concerned.
It may last long or it may not last long, but it may last long, Oren. There's, you know, the new rules that the party has this year, concentrated primaries near the beginning of the season, fewer debates. That was intended to give a front runner, presumably a Mitt Romney type candidate, although he lost the election, and not somebody from the far right like Michelle Bachmann peaked for a while in the last cycle and people like that. That's what they were trying to avoid. Instead, Trump is breaking out so much that maybe he's going to wind up getting the nomination partly because of these party rules.
Well, I don't think there's any chance he gets the nomination. I mean, this is silly season on both sides right now. You know, Bernie Sanders actually has more support among Democrats in both New Hampshire and Iowa than Donald Trump has among Republicans right now. And like you said, in 2012, these were the days of Herman Cain and Michelle Bachmann and, frankly, Newt Gingrich as well. And, you know, what we're seeing with Governor Walker is what happens over time. There are natural limits to a primary campaign. You run out of money, for one thing.
Trump won't run out of money.
Trump won't run out of money, but the other thing that happens is as you fall in the polls, your self-promotional interest in being in the race has to be traded off against your embarrassment to be in the race. And I think that's a factor for a lot of candidates, and that's going to come into play for Donald Trump, too. You know, as long as he's winning, the only thing he talks about is the fact that he's winning. But you're already seeing his poll numbers start to tail off. You're seeing him lose some of that free media, which is the only thing that's really feeding the campaign in the first place. And as soon as he's not in first place anymore, I think you're going to see a cycle where that feeds itself pretty quickly.
And some of that support went to Carly Fiorina after that last debate. She obviously took from Scott Walker as well. She took from Ben Carson as well. But she took some from Trump, who went down, as we showed before, from 32% before the debate to 24% after, still in first place. But here's one of the reasons. Carly Fiorina's answer in that last debate on the Planned Parenthood videos and defunding.
I dare Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama to watch these tapes, watch a fully formed fetus on the table, its heart beating, its legs kicking. while someone says we have to keep it alive to harvest its brain. This is about the character of our nation. And if we will not stand up and force President Obama to veto this bill, shame on us.
Now, she's been widely fact-checked on that, Christina, and there are no videos of squirming babies while people are saying we have to preserve the brain. But if she's going to be a candidate to challenge Hillary Clinton, and the Republicans put up a woman, and it's Carly Fiorina, and this is, of course, presuming that Clinton is the Democratic nominee, does she take women's votes away from Hillary Clinton if she's running against Planned Parenthood, running as the candidate who doesn't want a woman's face on the $10 bill or wouldn't answer that question because women are in a special interest group, and who opposes mandatory paid family leave as Clinton is running on?
Right. I don't think that she makes traction with women for those reasons you listed, but also some others. When you start to scratch the surface, I mean, she had her big debut, and I think people are very excited, and they want to be excited because she's not sort of crazy like Michelle Bachmann, and I'm always sensitive about calling women crazy, but that is a term that was often used with Michelle Bachmann, and she's not sort of unsmart the way many people talked about Sarah Palin. So as far as Republicans go, so far as female Republican candidates, she seems pretty legitimate. Once you scratch the surface and you look at her background as far as her time at Hewlett-Packard and some of her lack of leadership across the board, I don't really think she makes traction with a lot of women. Especially, you can never out-hawk Hillary Clinton when it comes to being a hawk. And Hillary Clinton is very stylized and understands what being a politician is about. And I think that over time, the lights may be a little too hot for Fiorina. I think we're seeing a very interesting moment for her right now. But as far as a real nominee, a presidential nominee, I actually don't see her being able to last with those issues that you listed.
And would Fiorina have a Mitt Romney problem? Forgive me, since you were a domestic policy advisor. That is, he got tagged first by Newt Gingrich in the primary campaign and then in the general as being somebody from one of these consulting companies that fires thousands of people for their own gain. She has a history at Hewlett-Packard of trying to increase profits by firing thousands of people and then not even increasing profits. So is there a kind of, you know, in the age of inequality, class-based issue with Carly Fiorina as the nominee?
Well, I think any business person would face some of that challenge, just because any business person has to make tough decisions, and there are times when that is potentially going to include layoffs. You know, I think the question about women is actually a really interesting one, because I think Fiorina will probably fade for a lot of the reasons that Christina described, but those aren't really gender-specific issues. You know, all of those things are reasons that men and women are likely to turn away from her. With respect to her gender, you know, women are not overwhelmingly pro-choice. Women certainly do not significantly support partial birth abortion, which is the issue that's being tackled there. And so I think actually she's likely to do very well with women and is probably most likely to be the vice presidential nominee for the Republicans at this point.
Which presents, I think, a really interesting, I think that's actually a more interesting matchup, just because when McCain tried it with Palin, there are many Republican women and independents, so weak-leaning Republicans and independents, who just could not go with McCain because of Sarah Palin. If the Republicans choose someone who then chooses Fiorina as their vice presidential nominee, then I think that actually Republicans have a shot, depending on who the presidential candidate
is. That's right,
is.
and I think a lot of the talents that you're seeing from her are actually ones that are very well suited to being a vice presidential nominee. She's relentlessly on message. She's a fantastic attack dog, and especially against Hillary Clinton, I think she'd be a real problem for Democrats.
So wait a minute, before we turn to immigration and bring in our researcher guest, you're saying Donald Trump, the #1 candidate, is not going to be the nominee. Carly Fiorina, the #2 candidate, is not going to be the nominee. Ben Carson, the #3 candidate, is not going to be the nominee.
Well, I haven't said that, but I would agree.
Who's going to be the nominee?
You know, I think at the end you're going to see Senators Rubio and Cruz up there, and I think you're going to see probably one of the governors.
Ted Cruz, really?
I think if you think about, you know, what he brings to the table for the right wing of the party, combined with his political skills, his track record that's very appealing to a significant portion of the primary base, he's very well suited to do well in a Republican primary once the Donald Trumps are out of the picture.
Isn't he from what people who call Michelle Bachmann this would call the crazy wing of the Republican Party?
I think there are a lot of Democrats who would call it the crazy wing of the Republican Party. I don't think they vote in the Republican primary.
I would say right now I'm looking at Rubio, even though he plays the good son, maybe he'll get some gravitas. Kasich is pretty interesting to me. And I think Bush will try and have a miracle happen. And we know that the Bush family is good at miracles. See 2000.
All right, stick around, the two of you. We're moving on. Time for evidence-based politics, where we meet a scholar who's actually studied an issue that is being oversimplified by campaign rhetoric like this.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. But I speak to border guards, and they tell us what we're getting.
Of course, Mexico isn't sending anyone here, as Donald Trump suggests, but who exactly is coming over the border and in what numbers? Get ready for a major rethink. A new study shows that in a recent 5-year period, immigration from Mexico not only dropped by more than half, but those coming are likely to have more education, more English, and more money than those who came before. Joining us via Skype, Professor Rogelio Saenz, a demographer and Dean of the College of Public Policy at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Thank you for joining us. Hello from New York.
Thank you very much for having me on your show, Brian. I really appreciate it.
And we're going to put up a graphic that we made that shows the basic bottom line finding from your study, which is that immigration from Mexico fell by more than half, comparing the periods of 2003 to 2007, that is just before the financial crisis, and comparing that to 2008 to 2012, the 5 years right after the financial crisis. That's a dramatic drop from about 2 million Mexicans coming to about 800,000. But why shouldn't we assume that this was plainly a result of the recession, there being a lack of jobs to come for, and that it will now rebound?
Yeah, well, historically, we know that economic factors have driven migration. And I think that these particular patterns that we see here are driven to a large extent by the economic crisis. But in addition to that, there are a variety of other factors, both in the United States as well as in Mexico, that also contributed towards these trends. For example, here in the United States, we've seen an increasing militarization of the border that has taken place. We've seen the increasing detentions, deportations that have taken place here in the United States. And in Mexico, we've also seen some trends. One of these, of course, has to do with the violence that we've seen in certain parts of Mexico, the cartel wars and so forth, that have made it increasingly difficult and more expensive for people to hire coyotes, human smugglers that can bring them to the United States. So in some ways, people that have been the traditional immigrants to the United States have been priced out because they don't have the resources to be able to come. And at the same time, those people with higher levels of resources, these are people that have been impacted by either themselves being sequestered or members of their family, and they have the resources to come to the United States. And one kind of large, overarching kind of a trend that is taking place in Mexico, and that will continue to impact the movement very dramatically in the future, is the aging that is taking place in Mexico. We think of Mexico as a youthful country, and for long, Mexico has had an excess labor force, and that's really shrinking dramatically. Mexican women right now, on average, are giving birth to about 2.3 children, whereas only a few decades ago, that was about 6 or so. So it's getting to be an aging population.
So those are interesting trends that you say, and this is census data. I'll throw that in, so it's probably reliable in terms of the numbers of people and their reported education levels and income levels and things like that. So you've just laid out reasons that this trend might continue for a while, even if the U.S. economy turns up. I want to ask you about the education levels. More educated Mexicans coming, which presumably would make them more desirable as immigrants. But looking at the numbers, there's still a majority of people coming from Mexico, close to half a million people, close to 500,000 people in your 5-year span, without even a high school diploma. And you find a high 15% unemployment rate even in these later years. That's almost triple the unemployment rate of the country as a whole. So is this an indication that the economy really cannot absorb as many Mexican immigrants as are choosing to come?
Yeah, a clarification. I'll start with the latter, having to do with the, these are people that are not in the labor force. 15% are not in the labor force. So these are individuals who are not working and who are not seeking employment. So that in order to look at the unemployment rate, it's different, because then you would be taking a look at individuals who are working and those that are that are unemployed and looking for work. So the point here that I was making in that interpreting that finding is that the Mexicans who are coming today tend to be less attached to the labor force than they did than the earlier cohort. The earlier cohort, I think there were about 10% that were not in the labor force, either because they have resources, because they may be have health problems, whatever the case may be, that does not allow them to work, or they could be going to school, whatever the case may be. But here, there was a about 5% higher, 15% individuals that were not part of the labor force. That leaves 85% that are either working or seeking employment.
Just one other thing real quick. Do those census numbers separate between people who came here legally and illegally? Because I don't see it in your paper.
Yeah, no, unfortunately, the Census Bureau only asked if people were born here in the United States. And another question has to do with naturalization, whether they become naturalized citizens. But that is also difficult to kind of equate with whether or not people are here legally or illegally, because you can think of somebody who comes in with proper documentation, green card, and so forth. So they are here legally, but they're not U.S. residents.
Professor Saenz, thank you very much for joining us. So let's turn back to our studio guests and get some very brief reactions to this. Christina Greer, is that an argument to allow more immigrants into the country, or not to be vigilant about closing the borders in light of the unemployment problem that people already here have?
Right. Well, as someone who studies immigration and intro to politics, we are a nation of immigrants. So I find it fascinating, this whole conversation about closing borders. We've never had that conversation before when immigrants were coming from Europe. Now, there were some tensions and people were upset, but we still opened the borders and we have integrated people over time for hundreds of years.
There's been ebb and flow, though. The borders were pretty well closed in the 1920s and didn't open up again until the Immigration Act of 1965.
Yeah,
right?
But we also did in the 40s and 50s, we definitely let people in. So I understand the concern, but I do think that we're at a moment right now in our country where we really have to think about our larger ethos and what it means to actually be a nation of immigrants. And I understand that there's some economic factors that we have to consider, but there is something to be said about allowing women and children and men actually leaving a country that is right now realistically unstable to actually make a life here. So whether they're educated, highly educated or not, I think that our borders need to be as porous as possible.
And Oren Cass, what do you take from that study in terms of policy implications for the best interest of the United States?
Well, I think there's a huge difference between closing the border and securing the border. I think a lot of the concern that people have right now is that the border is not secure, meaning that we don't have control over it. So regardless of what level of legal immigration we would like to have into the country and how we feel about being a nation of immigrants, if we can't control that, that's a fundamental rule of law issue that I think leaves the United States vulnerable to changes in its population it might not want, and also then creates long-term problems of illegal immigration.
So the question is, that we probably won't be able to answer today, how many is too many? Because people wouldn't be so concerned about illegal immigration if they just didn't want that many Mexicans here, right?
Well, I think the how many is too many is a fascinating question that gets obscured a lot of the time by the illegal immigration debate. Because the reality is that, while the ethos that Christina was describing is clearly a part of our history. It is not reflected in the American population in general right now. Americans overwhelmingly say we should have less legal immigration as opposed to more legal immigration. And we don't get to that debate because everyone's so focused on what to do about illegal immigration. But hopefully we will get to it, and it's a huge economic decision for the country.
And we're just about out of time. But I think if somebody said, oh, let's focus on legal immigration, as many politicians do, just stop the illegal immigration, and said, but we're going to have the same number of total immigrants from Mexico, the Trump supporters wouldn't say that's okay with me.
Right, exactly. And I think we also just need to be very clear. We're talking about Latino populations. We're not talking about white immigrants either, right? We're not talking about Canadians, and we're not talking about people from Scandinavian countries.
Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And that's POTUS 2016 for this week. Join us next week at this hour as we pit research against rhetoric yet again. And yes, the voting is still far off, but we have a democracy to keep. And forgive me, Mr. Frost, miles to go before we sleep. I'm Brian Lehrer.